In this video, we're continuing our series on funeral industries around the world, and we're heading to Ghana, a country in West Africa which I very much hope to visit one day. If people know anything about this country, it usually has to do with their elaborately handcrafted fantasy caskets that you've likely seen pictures on around the web. But there is so much more to it and its funeral industry than that. So before we start, we post death and dying related videos every Friday. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk the funeral industry of Ghana. Alright, let's get everyone up to speed with the basic facts about the country. So Ghana is located on the coast on the western side of Africa. While it is one of the geographically smaller countries on the continent, it does have quite a strong economy. As far as people go, it has a population of around 32 million with an average life expectancy of 62 for males and 66 for females. There are 6 main ethnic groups which are all subdivided as well. The Akan is the largest ethnic group, accounting for 45.7% of the country's population. The Moldagbani have 18.5% and the Yu have 12.8%, and smaller groups rounding out the other 23%. And I apologise, I know some of those pronunciations will be wrong. As for religion, 71.2% believe in one of the many versions of Christianity, thank you colonialism. 17.6% believe in some form of Islam, 5.2% claim traditional spiritual African beliefs, that's how they stated it in the census, 5.2% are atheist, and 0.8% believe in something else. Now, it should be said that while some of these ethnic groups have had issues in the past, Ghana remains one of the safest and most stable countries in Africa and has been for quite a long time. Okay, so with all that in mind, onwards to the death part. Funerals in Ghana. As hard as I tried, I could not find out how much Ghana's funeral industry was worth. But I found so many professionals saying that it was a massive amount, equal to or probably exceeding the wedding industry. So that kind of says a lot right there. Funerals are a big deal in the majority of Ghana, and it's not uncommon in some parts for the ceremony to last up to 7 days, drawing in thousands of people adorned in flowing red and black robes and gold jewellery. Some families even hire professional mourners to cry at the funeral of their loved ones, because as one funeral director said, it serves as a reward to the person who has died. Ghanaian funerals are heavily symbolic and have many rituals involved, including giving offerings to the spirits of the ancestors and loud traditional dancing and drumming to accompany the dead on their journey. A community elder elaborated that a significant part of funerals is bringing families together to embrace in handshakes, hugs, and to mourn in close proximity to each other. Another funeral director said that the average cost of a funeral in Ghana was between $15,000 and $20,000, equivalent to one person's annual salary. And he added that their usual Saturdays involve being in charge of at least 30 different funeral parties every Saturday, every year. This is because funerals go on over the entire weekend and allows families and friends who live far away to attend. Many regular folks say that funerals are a big part of the Ghanaian social life, much to the annoyance of many political and religious leaders. And whilst religion does play a big part in a Ghanaian funeral, traditional African religious practices also play a very big part in every Ghanaian funeral. As for the way a funeral is prepared, the way these events occur after someone dies is heavily divided between genders. It is the men who inform the community chiefs, and a male is the head mourner, and he oversees the proper organisation and execution of all rites pertaining to the death, particularly ensuring that the deceased has a funeral that befits his or her status, attained in life, and is compatible with the social standing of the family and the community. Ghanaian men in general are also not allowed to show emotions at funeral, or indeed often in their grief. Women have the responsibility to bathe and prepare the dead body to be laid in state for mourners to file past it. These women are usually members of the deceased family and are well versed in handling dead bodies. Women also fulfill the role of professional mourners or wailers. These gender-specific roles are starting to change, or at least not be relied upon so heavily, as communities realise the psychological toll that this is taking on individuals, particularly the men in the communities. Fantasy coffins. Okay, so we can't do a video on Ghana's funeral industry without talking about the infamous fantasy coffins. And probably the first thing to point out is that the use of these is not something the majority of Ghana's population does. Sorry to burst that bubble. So fantasy coffins are mainly used by the Ga people in the south of Ghana because of their religious beliefs regarding the afterlife. The Ga people believe that life continues into the next world in the same way as it did on Earth. Ancestors are also considered to be much more powerful than the living and able to influence their relatives who are still alive. And the social status of the deceased depends in part on the use of these elaborate coffins during burial. And yet these lavish caskets are only displayed on the day that they are buried with the deceased. These caskets often symbolise a deceased person's profession. However, certain shapes are considered appropriate only for those with appropriate status. Animals such as lions, cockerels and crabs may be used to represent clan totems, and only the head of clan families are permitted to be buried in coffins of that shape. Similarly, a sword or stool representing regal or priestly insignia is only appropriate to be used by those of this status. The use of these fantasy coffins is a fairly recent development, only starting around the 1950s when they were used only by chiefs and priests. Then in the 1960s, regular folk started using them as well. But the use of these didn't completely come out of nowhere. Previous to this, the Gar people had been using figurative palanquins and coffins since the early 20th century for those of high status. Now, as you can imagine, these elaborate coffins take quite a while to make and are generally made to order. Master carpenters employ one or more apprentices who carry out a large part of the work. This allows the artist to make several coffins simultaneously. Each coffin takes between 2 and 6 weeks to produce, depending on the complexity of the construction and the carpenter's level of experience. This is because the woodworking is done using simple non-electric tools, and the painting can take up to 2 days to complete. All up, these coffins cost around $1,000, which sounds cheap, but salaries are a lot lower over there. Still, it's probably best to cough up the money to avoid pissing off your ancestors. Criticisms. The way funerals are carried out in Ghana does come with quite a few criticisms from within the country. Aside from the gender divide that we spoke about earlier, the main criticisms put forth by various social leaders are the cost and the time. Ghanaian funerals are elaborate, going on for many days with hundreds of people requiring feeding, not to mention all the other costs. Social leaders are concerned that so many spend well beyond their means and end up with massive debt. And there is now social pressure to go bigger and better and outdo the Joneses next door. For those in urban areas, this is a huge financial burden, but like a wedding, it is doable. But for those in rural areas, usually farmers, it's just not. But shame, fear, and social pressure makes them do it, and they may not be able to afford basic necessities afterwards for quite some time. The second criticism is how long it takes to bury the dead. Not a problem for the Muslim minority, but for the majority, it is common for the dead to be left at the morgue for 2 to 10 months. One chief was left there for 6 years. Why? Because of infighting, usually around who will be the chief mourner. According to Ghanaian custom and tradition, which is upheld by law, once someone dies, the body belongs to the family. Now, what constitutes family should be simple, but like in many other countries, extended family members suddenly start to climb out of the woodwork to claim their fair share. And in this case, a spouse and children suddenly do not qualify as family once there is a death. It is only the family, referring to the extended family into which you were born, that decides on who the chief mourner is and all the other titles that come with it after death. Now, this family and chief mourner that they choose may not have seen or spoken to the deceased for the past 30 years, but they are deemed to know more about the dead person than the spouse and the children. There are then many meetings which can take weeks to draw up an obituary notice, and it is an intricate business getting the list of the mourners in the right order to ensure no offence is caused and that family feuds have not been started or old ones rekindled. All of this chaos is because the choice of the chief mourner is critical, and he is not only in charge of the funeral but also has the ultimate word on who succeeds the deceased in terms of social status and estate. Social leaders are in no doubt that the invention of morgue refrigeration is to blame, because now families can get away with this kind of behaviour as there's no real urgency to bury the dead. They also point out how disrespectful this is to the deceased and how disruptive it is to the grieving process of the living and the going on their way to meet the ancestors process for the deceased. So that certainly puts a dampener on things. Ghanaian funerals are loud and proud, and their funeral industry is massive. There is a lot of meaning and heart that goes into preparing these events. And while social leaders and some regular folk are concerned about the consequences of more recent aspects of these funerals, there is certainly a lot of positives that we can take away from them as well. But I'm still wondering how you bury a pilot's plane coffin in a regular grave, because if it's all about taking it with you to continue your profession in the afterlife, then you can't take it apart to bury it, and you can't very well turn up to the afterlife with a broken plane. Like, your ancestors are just not going to be impressed with that. Unless a broken plane is the way you died, I guess. Anyways, let us know in the comments what country you want us to cover next. And with that, go talk death.